Welcome to the 9th and, at least for now, final installment of the Better Together Food System Best Practices for Navigating COVID-19 discussion series. You'll remember we hosted about 5 of these earlier in the spring at the beginning of the pandemic, and over the last 4 weeks have brought it back to cover some really exciting topics on reemergence among restaurant operators, forecasting for better demand planning, and engaging consumers. And really excited to continue that conversation with a call today about food rescue. Before we dive into that, I'd love to give our speakers in particular, as well as you, a better idea of who is on the line today. So if I can ask Angel to bring up a quick poll, you'll see a few different options. If you can check the sector that best describes your organization, this will just give us a little more visibility in a time when we are not all in person together. Great, thank you so much. That's helpful for us as we get a sense of who is in the room. All right, well, this week, as I mentioned, very excited to be talking about the topic of food rescue, and also very excited to be introducing you to someone else to be moderating the discussion today. Alexandria Corey is ReFED's Capital and Innovation Director, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to her to provide some context, introduce our speakers, and then guide us through the rest of the conversation. Alex, it's all you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Hey, everyone. Very excited to be here with you all today. Recognize a lot of friendly names, at least out there. Can't see too many faces, but thank you so much for making the time. You know, we're all too familiar with the fact that food waste and hunger existed well before COVID ever came around, but it has certainly been exacerbated because of it. You know, on-farm food loss has skyrocketed, as has the number of Americans facing hunger and food insecurity, which our friends over at Feeding America, unfortunately, have estimated that that number is increasing from the average 40 million Americans to 54 million Americans because of COVID. You know, rather serendipitously, to be honest with you, back in the fall of 2019, and before any of us had heard of this novel coronavirus, ReFED launched a Food Recovery Accelerator, which immersed 10 high potential organizations, including the 3 organizations our panelists will be representing here today, in a customized program that is aimed really at helping them develop sustainable business models and technologies using human-centered design for their food rescue work. And most relevant to today's conversation, I'm really excited to share that ReFED actually recently released a brand new report, which details learnings gleaned from that accelerator program, and also that acts as a guide really for the entire food system on how to help scale innovative solutions to this problem. The report not only details 8 best practices, but also highlights important roles that technology and human-centered design can play as cross-cutting tools. It includes more than 20 case studies and insights from our accelerator expert network that consisted of 50 different organizations and members. And it also calls out specific stakeholder actions that are really necessary to make change. So while I won't go into all 8 of the best practices here myself that are detailed in the report, we'll no doubt hear much more about them from the panelists today, especially around strategic partnerships and collaboration, food safety, I'm sure, and definitely ensuring efficiency and consistency in logistics, transportation, and distribution, which are all so important during this time. And one other topic that will absolutely come up in the conversation today is this best practice around funding the vital work that is needed to rescue more perfectly good surplus food for those in need. And frankly, at ReFED, you know, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen firsthand that securing and distributing funding in the most impactful way has been a challenge for solution providers and funders alike during this pandemic, which is why back in May, ReFED launched a COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund. And the objective of that fund was really to act as a one-stop rapid response vehicle to quickly deliver this vital funding to organizations that could really scale their food waste reduction and hunger relief efforts, and which the 3 panelists that you'll hear from today are also grantees of. The team and I have frankly been absolutely humbled and really highly encouraged by the generosity of philanthropic donors across the country that have contributed more than $3.5 million to this fund, which has allowed us at ReFED to regrant 100% of those monies to the 37 for-profit and nonprofit organizations that you're seeing on your screens. And hot off the press just today, this is impact numbers that are nobody else knows, so you're the first to hear it. I'm excited to share that as of today, thanks in part to this vital funding, their work has driven incredible impacts from Hawaii to New York. We've got Minnesota down to Texas, and that includes rescuing more than 48 million pounds of food, serving more than 5 million individuals, and creating or retaining more than 2,000 jobs. And that's just in the last 3 months alone, which is incredibly impressive. So huge round of applause, you know, and respect to all of these 37 organizations, including the panelists that you'll hear from today. And speaking of the importance of funding and the role funders can play during these challenging times, I've actually asked Ida Posner to share a few words before we dive into our discussion, not only because Ida has been a member of the Accelerator Expert Network, she's also been one of the first believers in the need for the COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund. And last but not least, she's been a wonderful thought partner and supporter of the movement over all these years. So for those of you who haven't had the chance to get to know Ida yet, she is a strategic advisor to the Posner Foundation of Pittsburgh. She actually has a full-time role as well as Vice President of Strategic Planning at RDC, which is a privately held railroad investment and management group based in Pittsburgh as well. And prior to joining RDC, Ida actually spent 3 years working with the Pisces Foundation, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with out in San Francisco, where she was first introduced to ReFED, which we're so grateful for, and luckily that helped spark her passion for fighting food waste. So with that, Ida, I'd love to open up to you and just have you share a little bit about why this topic is really important to the Posner Foundation, highlight a couple things that you've learned or gained through kind of your participation and involvement so far, and any words of advice that you have for others that really want to get involved in the sector.
Thanks so much, Alex. As Alex said, Ida, I'm coming from the Posner Foundation based in Pittsburgh, and we seek high leverage opportunities to advance long-term solutions to social, economic, and environmental challenges in our backyard and around the world. So we mainly work in the spaces of education, human rights, Jewish life, and the environment, which is where food waste comes in. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time talking about why food waste. I think because you're here, you know about the problem and why it's critical to address it. But from our perspective, when we view food waste, we're really thinking about food waste as one topic, but the multitude of other impacts that solving it really has. So health, nutrition, hunger, the environment, economic development. And to me, what's really great about food waste is that it's a problem with solutions. I mean, we've seen not only through the ReFED roadmap, but a number of people have said, you know, this is an issue we can solve now. We just need to implement the solutions. But in order to do that, we have to match the right people with the right resources. And so that's where ReFED comes in. And I think one of ReFED's greatest strengths is really the power of the network. It's a true multi-stakeholder collaborative. It's not just a bunch of jargon that says, you know, this is how many meetings we've had and this is how many people we've talked to. It really is bringing action to the ideas. Our foundation is very lightly staffed. We have an absolutely fantastic executive director, but we have a staff of one. And so another great opportunity here is for us to be able to leverage ReFED's expertise and reach throughout the entire ecosystem and really tap into that the broad view of the entire food waste ecosystem. So ReFED's able to really listen to the market and go all the way up from national programs down to local voices and start to build this infrastructure and really fill the void where we're having these gaps between, you know, who's talking to who and what resources need to go where. And that goes both on the financial side of how do we get more funding to address the issue, but also the human capital side of things. And I think that's something that in the past 5 years, as I've seen ReFED grow, building that human capital and that infrastructure has proven to be really critical. I've been involved with ReFED, I guess since 2015, right before the roadmap was released, and it's pretty incredible to see how much the organization has grown and strengthened in those few years. And again, we're not really measuring impact by how many meetings we had. It's not the number of the people in the room. It's the right people in the room. It's the right conversations. It's choosing the right strategy at the right time. And so from a funder's perspective, you know, we like to measure how much data we have on something. You know, can we really measure impact? And data and information is great, and best practices are really important, but if you're not getting that information into the right hands of the decision makers and the right stakeholders, you're not actually leveraging it, you're not actually making change. So building that infrastructure is really important. And also being able to adapt quickly and really implement solutions when they can make the most impact. So thinking back over the past year with the Accelerator and the Response Fund, you know, COVID was a crisis for sure. But it was also a huge opportunity, and it was this almost natural experiment that was thrown upon everyone. And food became something that maybe, you know, was in the back of people's minds about food security. All of a sudden, it was all over the news. It was very front of mind, and it became this moment. And ReFED was ready to take advantage of this and to really have an impact for everyone's lives across the country. And that was because the infrastructure was in place, and that was built during the Accelerator. You know, building the network of organizations working on this issue who knew what resources were out there, who to talk to, who they should be sharing best practices with, and you know, how to get everything done. That was all the pre-work was done. And so we saw all these pilot programs that were in people's minds were quite literally accelerated into being launched and coming to life. So COVID really became the test of the Accelerator network, and I think the test worked. It wasn't a scramble. You know, the fund was put together, and that was a ton of work on the part of ReFED staff. And I know behind the scenes, everyone's working incredibly hard. But it wasn't a scramble. It was, okay, we've been doing this. We've been here. We know the people. We know what resources need to go where, and we know how to leverage this network. So it was a pretty incredible show of, yes, it makes sense to invest in the network upfront. It makes sense to take the time to build the infrastructure, because when we need it, it's ready, it's there, and we can have a true rapid response fund. So very excited to hear more from 3 of the fantastic participants from the Accelerator who are also recipients of the fund today, and to hear all about their experiences.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ida, for the kind words and just for your participation and support over these years. It's been fantastic. So yeah, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce the excellent panel that we have for you guys today. So kicking things off here, we've got Jennifer Boone, who is the Director of Sourcing at Brighter Bites. Jennifer comes to Brighter Bites from ProAct, which is a national network of produce distributors, where she was responsible for helping to develop wholesale markets for local farms. And she's also worked with members to promote sustainability, especially through waste reduction, which has a lot to do with the work that she continues to do at Brighter Bites. Next, we've got Katie Marchini. She's the COO of RePlate, and there she works towards a world where everyone has access to nutritious food and where no food goes to waste. She actually joined RePlate after working as director of operations for a catering company. So she got firsthand experience and witnessed just the amount of surplus food that is generated by that catering industry. And she's doing something about it now at RePlate. And last but not least, we've got Brian Moran. Brian has more than 5 years of experience with charitable food and homeless services. And he actually joined Plentiful back in early 2017. And as the director of DevOps for City Harvest and Plentiful, he oversees product development and operations of the technology. So thank you all for being here with us today and really being willing to kind of open, the book, share with us about your experiences, what that's been going through the pandemic, and also some best practices that you have identified for scaling your food rescue and hunger relief work. So I guess first question, I don't want to assume anybody has heard about the work that you guys do before because it is so fantastic. So just would love to go around the horn here, maybe starting with Jennifer. Give us the 101 on your organization, your mission, vision, and then share some impact stats just to level set us on the scale of the work.
Sure. Thank you so much for including Brighter Bites in this important conversation. Brighter Bites is a nonprofit that delivers fresh produce to low-income families through schools. And we teach them how to use it and track their behavior change. So each week, families take home about 20 pounds of fresh produce. That's roughly 50 servings. That's the really important part. And it's comprised of 8 to 12 different varieties of fruits and vegetables. We work with food banks, produce growers, distributors, transportation companies, commodity boards, elementary schools, just a whole host of partners to make this happen. We started in 2012 in Houston, Texas, and since then have expanded to Dallas, Austin, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Southwest Florida. We work with over 100 schools now and to date have distributed over 30 or almost 38 million pounds of fresh produce to hundreds of thousands of families across the country. And of that, almost 10.5 million pounds of fresh produce have been distributed through our pandemic response just since April. So really have ramped up our operations to respond.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. Katie, we'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me here today. So I am CEO at Replay, and we are a nonprofit food rescue organization based out of Oakland, although we do have operations nationally. So our second largest market after the Bay Area is New York, but we're also in Los Angeles, Austin, Boston, Chicago. And so we take surplus food, mostly from catered events, and bring it to soup kitchens, shelters, job training programs, and youth programs to make sure that we are addressing food insecurity at all levels, not just the places where we see it most visibly. And since 2016, we've rescued 2.8 million pounds of food. And during the pandemic, we've been bringing food to individuals as well. And that's been about 1,000 meals per month that we've been bringing to individuals in addition to our normal work.
Thanks, Katie. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian. I'm Director of DevOps at City Harvest, but I work exclusively on Plentiful. Plentiful is a joint project between City Harvest and United Way. It's a lightweight CRM tool for food pantries that allows clients to make reservations at food pantries across New York City. As I said, I work for City Harvest. I work for a food rescue organization who's the largest in New York City, who's going to rescue about 109 million pounds of food this year. But Plentiful, which is kind of my project, has grown tremendously during COVID. We've seen over 550,000 visits just since the beginning of March, with over 200,000 unique households coming through the system. That's up about 48% from last year. And we saw this spike instantaneously at the beginning of COVID to numbers we weren't forecasting to see for years. At the moment, we're just in New York City, but we are actively working to grow Plentiful and fund it and roll it off into its own company and sustain it and take it to the rest of the country.
That's great, Brian. Well, maybe let's stay with you, Brian. So let's dig in a little bit more. Talk to us a bit about how COVID has affected your operations and what challenges have really arisen over the past few months because of that.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of changes to our operations, we went in New York City as one of these things we built Plentiful around was the lines at food pantries. These lines typically weren't inconvenience. They were about an hour and a half long from measurements we took. And we talked to food pantries across the country, and it seems they're pretty standard. You're going to see a food pantry, you'll see a line outside. That line quickly went from an inconvenience to a health hazard, having people wait outside in crowded groups. So we saw at the beginning of COVID, a bunch of pantries, especially small faith-based ones, close due to COVID, run by seniors. And at the same time, we saw an overwhelming growth in new users, going from average of 50, 60 new self-registrants a day to over 1,000 some days. And with that, we had to have pantries to direct them to. And we do so through a simple text message service and through an Android app. As part of the growth and challenges is really scaling some of those systems up. We went from the same time period last year, sending about 500, 600,000 messages to sending over 5.7 million this year. So in technology perspective, we had a ton of scaling to do, well, directing people to new programs, advertising new emergency relief sites, bringing new programs on board, converting pantries to reservations. In long-term for stability, we are working on building out web applications, more native applications for phones in order to lower SMS costs and bring this to more users. One of our kind of critical points is you have to have a cell phone to use Plentiful, and we're working to mitigate that by building a web app that anybody can use.
Yeah, that's great. Katie, how about you? Kind of what challenges has COVID brought up in your business operations and the model that you guys had, and what are some of those challenges?
Yeah, so I'll echo a little bit of what Brian has said, which is that, a lot of the smaller organizations that we were bringing food to have had to close down because they were relying on volunteers. So that was number one. But number two, we had mostly worked with prepared food, and obviously people aren't going into the office for meals or to work, and so they're also not having meals. And so our prepared food surplus that we were getting decreased significantly. So we had to really think about, okay, where is the surplus at and how can we get it to people in a safe way? So during this time, we pivoted a little bit, and while we were still doing pickups and bringing it to large recipient agencies that were still open, what we tried to do is figure out, okay, what are the partners that we have right now, and how can we get meals created to bring directly to individuals in their homes that we know, need food, but suddenly, the nearest pantry or place that they had been accessing food previously is closed, or it's harder to get to because, public transportation has also decreased during this time and it's just unsafe to congregate. And so we're making sure that we're getting food to those individuals by working directly with some of those smaller agencies that we had been working with, having conversations with them and saying, who's most at risk, and can you, get in communication with them and pass along our information so we can get them signed up to bring meals directly.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that definitely is one of the best practices that maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, but just it's about, bringing food to that end recipient more effectively, more conveniently to them. And, I'll also just point out, and then we'll pass it back over to you, Jennifer, but, with our traditional food system right now, when COVID hit, there were these two main sources or end points for food, right? It was either retail or it was food service restaurant. And I kind of think, as I'm hearing you speak so far, guys, that, the donation system also kind of had its own channels for the surplus food, right? Like there's feedstock that generally came through certain sources. And especially in your case, Katie, what I think you're highlighting and what I've heard from many recovery organizations is that their initial or traditional sources of food or donation just kind of dried up or needed to shift. And so that's something, we can talk a little bit more about as we go through this, but exciting to hear that you guys were able to solve that as well. But Jennifer, yeah, let's talk about some of the COVID challenges that you guys faced.
As a last mile food distributor who primarily distributes through schools, we were, as Brian and Katie were mentioning, one of those organizations that there was a moment where we were worried as to how we were going to continue to distribute since schools had closed. That was really our first visible challenge that COVID brought up. Thankfully, we were quickly able to come up with new locations for distribution, but that school closures was a huge challenge for us. Additionally, we had some changes that we had to implement that were surrounding our volunteer model. So we're highly reliant on volunteer labor and utilize volunteers to help pack the produce bags that families would take home with them. And obviously having volunteers standing shoulder to shoulder, packing zucchini and lemons and potatoes into a bag via an assembly line wasn't exactly something that we could do any longer. So that's another challenge we've had. And then probably just the most difficult underlying challenge has just been the huge changes that we've seen in market conditions for fresh produce. Since we are exclusively a fresh produce distributor, we have been beholden to these wild swinging market conditions. So first there was a huge amount of product available when restaurants shut down. Then all of that initial surplus dried up and product was left in the fields, but it was hard to access. And then we've had just varying degrees of increases in supply and increases demand as we've seen these last few months play out. So those are definitely the main challenges that we've experienced.
And Jennifer, I'm really interested to hear more about these new channels that you guys were able to source otherwise wasted food from, particularly on farm. And so maybe kind of starting up the next bit of questioning here, talk a little bit about the lessons and best practices that you would kind of raise up that's been most relevant for you guys sustaining your business and really getting that impact and that food out to those in need? And have you needed to kind of adapt any of the best practices that you really started the year off with thinking we're going to kind of carry you through 2020, but really need to be adjusted to a world, post-COVID?
So number 4, which is expand the value proposition, and number 6, which is establish strategic partnerships and collaborations. Those two have really been the main lessons that we have relied on throughout this time. Specifically, expand the value proposition. So the way that we look at it is really understanding our partners and what their needs are, coming to the table with a solution rather than just a list of benefits that we can offer. And so one example of this is immediately when COVID hit and schools shut down, and we saw our partnerships with food banks change just because of their position as an emergency feeder. We had to really quickly shift, and we were having conversations with food service partners, with our produce partners, and learned that there was this huge surplus at the food service distributor level. So in order to kind of help our food service distributor partners who were unable to find placement for that product with food banks because they had all kinds of food from other partners, we set up a partnership with them so that they would pack boxes filled with their excess inventory. So they'd use their staff, they'd get rid of their excess inventory and pack boxes. So we didn't need volunteer labor to be able to pack those boxes. And then they delivered directly to our sites. So that was a way that we were able to expand our value proposition as an outlet for this food, as well as maintain our ability to reach families that were experiencing food insecurity. But on the on-farm level, we have had conversations with our produce partners who previously were able to just donate product to us, but we understood the challenges that they were experiencing, which was not having demand. So not really having any need to even get the product out of the fields. They had tons of walk-by acres that were just going to be disked under. So we needed to be able to help them cover their costs to even get that product out of the field. And through the help of ReFED and the fund, we were able to have a conversation with them, understand what their break-even costs were on their picking and packing out, as well as their cooling, and an offer to cover just that, whatever cents a pound it was on any given commodity. And in that way, we could have value for them by being able to help them get the product out of the field, as well as provide more product to families experiencing food insecurity.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. Katie, what best practices or lessons have you guys come across about how best to operate in this environment?
Yeah, so I think one that really comes to mind is safety. Generally, we're always talking about food safety, but I think food safety right now has been expanded just to mean general safety. And so I think for us, it was really making sure that our food rescuers had access to proper PPE and hand sanitizer and gloves. And something that, we hadn't considered really until this happened is generally our food rescuers were able to, wash their hands regularly because they were entering offices and kitchens. And suddenly when that's taken away, you have to have a conversation about how to maintain safety. And I think the other thing is considering, during COVID, particularly a lot of people have the luxury of, getting their groceries delivered to them, but the populations that we're serving do not have that luxury. And many times they're having to congregate. And so making sure that we're taking that into consideration and going, okay, how can we make this as safe as possible for end beneficiaries and not just assume that the normal model of lining up for food is what's best right now, because it's not, and it's not what's most safe. And if other people, are being asked to not congregate, why should this one particular group of people who are food insecure have to be risking their lives just to be fed? So one is safety. And then two, I think strategic partnerships during this time have been really important. I think we had been doing partnerships that, in normal times wouldn't have quite been a perfect fit. But during this time, when we want to make sure that we're just making sure that people are fed, even if it's not surplus food that's being recovered. So for example, we had a partnership with Beyond Meat that was brought to us through DoorDash. They wanted to donate a bunch of food because they recognized how much food insecurity was increasing during this time and how much need there was. And so we worked with them, and that was great because it was a source of earned revenue for us because they were paying us to do pickups, but also was a way to get food to people. And so I think just really leaning on partnerships that we already had in different ways and thinking creatively about how we could continue to work with different people. And many of our food donors, for example, have transitioned their catering budget that they were normally using to feed their employees to purchase meals from restaurants that we would then deliver to individuals. And that's, definitely outside of our normal operating procedures, but they wanted to make sure that they were helping their community, and we wanted to make sure that people were still getting fed. And so that's how we kind of worked it out.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Anything to add, Brian, from you guys' perspective of what you've learned or best practices you're applying?
Yeah, so what we've really learned is that there's all these misconceptions about data and food and everything else, and everything typically operates on delay. At the very, very beginning of COVID, I was asked on a panel about 2 weeks into the crisis in New York City. And they're like, oh, we're still a month out from seeing the real hit at food pantries. And I pushed back immediately saying, well, I'm seeing the data increase right now. All the reporting I know happens end of the month, but we're seeing these numbers go up and up. And I was pushed back on, rightfully so, and going, How do you know those people aren't just coming from other food pantries that have closed? So we started surveying, and within up to this point, we've got 22,000 results on the survey asking people who are new to the food pantries on Plentiful if they've been to a food pantry in the last 6 months, and the overwhelming response has been no. 83% are saying we have not visited a food pantry in the last 6 months. So we're seeing a rush of new clients, which helped us pivot our communication tools and extend a value proposition number 6 by going out and going, okay, we have a bunch of clients from this zip code who need food, working with our emergency relief sites to get sites up and running in that neighborhood, and then send messages directly to the clients in those neighborhoods to get them the emergency food they need. That, and partnering with groups like Hunter College, Twilio, Hunger Free America, and recently IBM to help coordinate all the data sourcing we do, because we maintain very, very accurate schedules of food pantries, and it's a problem in New York City finding a food pantry that's operating. It's often the church's hours are listed, not the food pantry's hours. And being able to relate to them in real time what the status of that food pantry is it open, is it closed? So people always have the most up-to-date information trying to find a site.
That's great. One question actually that I'm seeing come in from the audience here has to do with kind of ensuring that you have the right team and support around you to do the work that you need to do. And I think all three of you have kind of referenced the importance of volunteers in your model, how reliant we are on volunteers. And so the question comes into, you know, what changes in the volunteer or employee models have you guys seen? And how do you anticipate that changing in the long term, or what needs to change in the long term in that regard? Just want to throw it out to the room here, see if you guys have any thoughts there.
To be clear, we don't rely on volunteers, and particularly for this reason. We want to make sure that, one, that we're employing people and, you know, helping to reduce food insecurity by creating jobs. But I think what we have noticed is seeing, you know, the recipient agencies that we rely on to do the actual distribution of the food do really heavily rely on volunteers. And so we've kind of had to work around that by bringing food to individuals. But I think it's really, one, our food rescuers have been really willing to do the extra work to make sure that they're doing contactless deliveries and having frequent conversations, but also our operations team being able to say, hey, things are very different right now. You're not going to be answering the same type of questions on Intercom, which is like our little chat bot for donors and recipients to reach out. You're going to have to be doing different work to help us find new partnerships, and things are going to be much more complicated right now. So I think it's just communicating to the team that things are going to be different and that their job is going to shift during this time until things settle.
I'll echo what Katie said. We definitely have had to do a lot of communicating to our team around shifting roles. And our team has been incredible and really embraced new roles, which have gone from being able to pack product inside a air-conditioned school gym to having to pack product or distribute product outside in the heat in Houston, Texas for hours in the afternoon. So there's just been a huge amount of receptiveness to that changing responsibility. Our volunteer model relied on parents from the schools in which we operated. And so as we look to our new distribution model, we are less reliant on volunteers because we are relying more on strategic partnerships with for-profit companies, specifically food service distributors. So while that has definitely increased our need for funding to be able to support that new partnership, it is decreasing our reliance on volunteers.
Great. So let's shift the conversation a little bit into funding and how important funding is, obviously, in a time like this. Talk to us a little bit, maybe we'll start with you, Brian, about how COVID has affected funding for your operations. What has that kind of enlightened, where the needs for more funding are, and any best practices that your lessons that you've had in terms of how to remain financially stable in a time like this?
So yeah, it's an interesting one for us because, as I said, our client usage has surged, which is the primary cost driver around Plentiful. Sending and receiving messages to clients, updating software, paying for dev time, all these things increased with the increased usage on the platform. Luckily, we've got great funders like ReFED that stepped up and really helped us out here. We've also worked really closely with our for-profit partners, such as Twilio. We use all of our text messaging Twilio. That's by far my biggest bill every month. And through COVID, they've been great working with us on, one, special rates for being a nonprofit, to special discounts on top of that due to COVID, and then work with us to structure long-term growth strategies, plans with them, and how to best utilize their platform. They've really helped us out there. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we are in the process right now of fundraising with the idea of spinning Plentiful off into a new company and taking it to more and more locations around the country. And as such, we've had to kind of reevaluate some of our earned revenue model and how we price things and what services we offer. So we're building things like new mobile apps and a web app to help bridge those costs and keep the costs low for the individual pantries. But it's required rethinking a lot of assumptions we had, given we're seeing usage numbers I didn't expect to see until we had 4 or 5 times as many pantries on board. So it really shifted things around, and it's a great thing to see from my end because people are using the software as it was designed and built, and it's working. But at the same time, those do have real world dollar costs that we have to mitigate.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been saying a lot recently, it takes money to make money, it takes money to make impact. So absolutely. Katie, you want to talk a little bit about how COVID's affected you guys and kind of how you guys are remaining financially stable?
Yeah, so, prior to COVID, we had an earned revenue stream, and that was about 40% of our overall revenue. So this has been a huge shift for us because our earned revenue is way down during this time. So we have had to rely more heavily on philanthropy. And so I think the biggest thing for us was making sure that we were going to our current funders or past funders and saying, hey, we have this need. As you know, previously we were on our way to being, financially stable on our own. And this is a huge wrench in our plans, and we've had, strong impact. And so we want to make sure that we're able to kind of continue having that impact and that we don't just disappear in the next 6 months because this thing that nobody predicted happened. And so we've been really lucky. We have both with ReFED and Cisco in particular has been a huge funder of ours. And so both of those grants have really helped us, particularly the ReFED grant, because as I mentioned previously, during this time, our biggest goal was just making sure we were feeding people, and the recovering surplus part was kind of on pause for a period of time. It was like, if there's surplus to recover, of course we'll do it, but it wasn't our main goal. Our main goal was just making sure that the recipients that were relying on us were still getting food. And so the ReFED grant has been really great because we needed to get back to recovering some surplus because we have other grants, particularly some government ones that require us to recover surplus. And so many of our donors are not able to pay to have the food picked up anymore. And so we're kind of subsidizing the cost in the meantime. And this has allowed us to help really some other recipient organizations that already had partnerships built out with grocery stores and other donors to be able to say, hey, we know that you guys are really low bandwidth during this time. Can we help you out? Is there any food that you aren't getting recovered right now because you're really low bandwidth? And they're like, yes, here, please help us. So getting back to actually recovering surplus during this time because of those grants has been really useful.
Thanks. Jennifer, anything to add about the impacts of COVID on funding?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, our decrease in reliance on volunteer labor, among other things, has really dramatically increased our need for funding, as well as the pace at which we need to fundraise. Fortunately, a lot of donors are shifting their focus and supporting organizations like the ones on this call. Also, thank you, ReFED, that are working in the food access and hunger relief space. And also, we're seeing some of our funders, as well as just funders in this space, supporting their existing grantees. Nationally, we've seen just some extraordinary generosity with $11.4 billion to address COVID crisis and $7.6 billion to address racial inequities. But I think we're just going to see a long-term change in donors' priorities. But overall, what we're seeing in conversations with our development director, we're seeing an increased emphasis on donors making contributions for organizations to use it where they need it. So instead of funding specific projects or funding like small side things that more serve the funding organization, we're seeing funding for operating reserves and for just general support. And that's been hugely, hugely important for Brighter Bites. And the last thing that I wanted to mention regarding best practices is we've lost out on some revenue from having to cancel an event, but through nurturing our relationships with our donors, specifically through transparent communication and making the most out of technology, we think that we're going to be able to lay a foundation to weather this crisis. Additionally, through really creating a culture of philanthropy in our organization by empowering all levels of our organization to take an active role in fundraising.
That's great. And, you know, not to put her on the spot here, but we do have, you know, a strategic advisor to a foundation on the line, and Ida Posner. So maybe Ida, I want to kick it over to you and just, you know, from your perspective, what you've heard from the panelists, does that sound right from a funder perspective? How, you know, what advice do you have for food rescue organizations that are out there, how they can best have conversations with their funders in an environment where unexpected funding needs are popping up or things are changing so rapidly? Any advice that you might have for those on the line?
Yeah, so I think this is, again, it's been a really interesting past few months. And, you know, when I introduced the foundation, I read the first half of our mission statement, but the second half says that we like to invest where others may not. And I think that has really driven a lot of our funding decisions over the past few months. I think in any crisis, you go through waves of what's the hot thing to be funding, right? You know, at the beginning, it really was the food banks. And then we are going through this, you know, social justice moment, and there's a lot of funding going there. And so, you know, you get these bursts of everyone donating to the issue that's most front of mind. So we really tried to think about, okay, after that, you know, evens out, where are the funding needs? And with our existing partners, you know, that was fabulous because we already have a relationship with them, and we were able to say, okay, you know, what's the short-term need? What's the Band-Aid? We know this isn't going to fix the systemic issues, but what do you need right now? And then once you have time to breathe, let's have a conversation about how this shifts your priorities, how this shifts your strategy. And I think breaking it out into those two components of what's the immediate need, what is the short-term fix, and then how do we think about this longer term, and how does this change, you know, your organization and your work? Those are the two conversations we really wanted to have. So I think for organizations, you know, trying to build that funder relationship, again, I mean, the more you invest up front, the better. And at least from our perspective, you know, the last thing we want to do in the middle of a crisis is create more work for the organizations who are doing the work. I mean, that is the most, we want to have people fed. We want to have people healthy and safe. And so the more we can do to make that communication easier and not generate extra work, the better. So I think a lot of it, again, just comes down to that relationship building, the communication, and identifying the gaps. And I'll say one more thought that I've been personally thinking about as it relates to food is that philanthropy tends to be in big cities, right? You know, you get a lot of foundations in big urban areas, and food is such a local issue that I think there's a disconnect between where the philanthropic dollars physically are and where they need to go. And so from my perspective, that was another big benefit to the ReFED COVID Response Fund, is that sitting in Pittsburgh, I know what's going on around here, and maybe I have some connections other places in the country, but I don't know what's going on in most of the country. And so being able to figure out, again, you know, where does the money need to go to have the highest impact, that's been really crucial.
Fantastic. Those are great points, Ida. Thanks so much for that. One thing just hearing you talk to that it makes me think a lot about is I think sometimes we get really laser focused on funders acting as the financial support to a lot of this work. But I think what is often not thought about, and that really deserves much more focus and attention, is that funders themselves can act and provide much more support beyond just financially. So I guess one question I'd like to throw out to the panelists here is, like, of all of your funders in your network, have there been some examples of where funders have really stepped up and supported in non-financial ways, whether that's been connections to supply or partnerships, as you guys have highlighted? Like, talk a little bit about what that looks like and any kind of insights you have on non-financial ways that funders can be helping to support work like yours.
Yeah, sure. Actually, we just wrapped up an engagement. One of United Way's close partners is IBM. And we just finished a 5-week engagement with a corporate social responsibility team made up of 6 developers, UX and UI engineers, and product marketers to really look at our pantry interface and our onboarding system and how we get pantry started on Plentiful. In New York, we've typically had in-person teams on the ground, which is not as feasible as it used to be. And our plan was train the trainer workshops in other cities to get pantries online, and traveling being less feasible, they really took a hard look at this and offered 5 weeks of 6 full-time consultants worth of work to help us really come up with some great designs and help text and contextual help the entire system that we're working on implementing. And this is immensely valuable. Would have cost us several $100,000 worth of cost to design and implement ourselves, and was provided pro bono. And it was an amazing benefit. And this is just kind of one of those things that, well, not a direct cash injection, is something that's extremely helpful for us.
Kind of tying it back to the value proposition best practice that I mentioned earlier, if a nonprofit is going to be providing value to a for-profit, it's critical that they understand that business. And so what we've seen that's been hugely valuable for us through some of our funders is beyond the financial funding, just sitting down and talking with us and teaching us about the industry or teaching us about that particular company. And I've got 2 great examples. One, Cisco with an S, Cisco Corporation, the food company, previously was a big funder of ours, but our main contact there, the vice president of produce, would sit down with our founder of our organization and just talk about the produce industry, just help her understand how food moves across the country and what are some of the challenges and where is it coming from. Interestingly, he has since become our CEO in his retirement from Cisco. So a great tie there. The Produce Marketing Association also is another great funder, great partner of ours. And they have been just incredible in connecting us in a deeper way with the industry and making introductions to produce companies, transportation companies, and just giving us exposure to talk about our work and generate interest amongst the industry.
And before I pass it to you, Katie, to see if you have anything to add there, just I love that line, Jennifer, about like actually recognizing that we need to understand how our donors actually operate, what's important to them, like what their day-to-day looks like, so these solutions can just tie right in really easily. I think that's something that Nell Fry over at Sodexo talks a lot about. She's actually highlighted in the report, and there's some nice insights from her, but she's like, you got to understand what our day-to-day looks like, and what, you know, sometimes people ask of that team is really above and beyond what they're able to do. And because the asks are often misaligned or too big, you know, as much as an organization like a Sodexo might want to do something, it makes it challenging, right? So I love that you guys have taken on this kind of knowledge learning that you want to do and seeing that as a value. So perfect, perfect note there. And Katie, anything else to add from your end?
Yeah, I would just say when we found out about that shelter in place was happening, we were actually in a board meeting. And so Steve McCormick, who is our board chair from Draper Richard Kaplan Foundation, has been a huge, both emotional and strategic support during this time. And I think that Draper Richard Kaplan has really given us, one, like they created some, you know, basically like an emotional support group for leaders of companies during this time. So we could talk about what challenges we were facing. And I thought that that was extremely helpful to be like, you know, we're not the only organization kind of feeling right now like we are in a pivotal moment where it's make it or break it for our org. So that was incredibly helpful. AWS connected us with Slalom, who has done some volunteer work on our website's back end for operational tools for our team, which has been super helpful. And then Kroger, in this time, we have been kind of looking to work with different types of food generators and working on recovering their surplus. And one of those is working more with grocery stores. And so Kroger very generously donated their time to talk to us about their food recovery program that they have across the US, and really like allowed us to dig deep and do some user research. So all of those different funders providing kind of different support, both emotional and strategic, and it's very appreciated.
That's great. Well, I want to be conscious of time here. Before we wrap things up, I think I have one final question that I'll throw out to the panelists as well as to you, Ida, in case you have any thoughts on it as well. But, you know, a lot of what's been happening in this space, at least initially when COVID first hit, was really rapid, immediate response, right? We're all just all hands on deck, everybody kind of getting out there and doing what they need to do. But quite quickly here, we need to be parallel pathing this conversation about how we're building a more resilient system going forward. And so just would love to hear your guys' thoughts on what's kind of one call to action or one change that you really would like to see that you think would lead to a more resilient, and I would add equitable food system going forward.
I mean, I've said this before, Alex, in conversation with you, and I'll say it again. Increasing SNAP benefits is a huge one for creating a more equitable food system. The government gave a lot of money to create this farm box program for food banks. And while that program has been helpful, it did essentially force people to stand in line to wait for food when they could have been going to the grocery store and having autonomy over what they were going to receive. And I just think that, you know, we need to rely less on the charitable food system if we're going to create a more equitable food system.
I agree with you 100%, Katie. And I think that we get into this rut of always combining the conversation of food waste and food insecurity. And while they're 100%, they're incredibly linked, they are two distinct things. And the mindset needs to shift from thinking that hunger can be solved through reducing food waste. Because if we are relying on food waste to decrease food insecurity, then if we reduce food waste, we reduce that outlet to help feed people that are experiencing food insecurity. So I agree with Katie that SNAP benefits are really a critical piece here. But I also think that nutrition education, which is something that Brighter Bites focuses heavily on, is really important to increase consumption of fresh produce and drive demand through those SNAP benefits.
I love that piece. I would add like workforce development and jobs training is also a way to really distinguish between hunger and food security. So I appreciate that piece. Yeah, Brian, anything from you?
Twofold on my one. I want to echo what Katie and Jennifer just said around client dignity. Like, as much as I work exclusively with food pantries these days, it's not the most ideal situation to have to visit a food pantry and stand online when we try to get rid of lines wherever we can. Much better off shopping with SNAP at a grocery store than you are ever having to visit a food pantry. It's just a more dignified experience. You get what you want. And really taking a look from the ground up at the dignity across the entire system of what's needed, what's not, just some of the stigma around using SNAP, some of the stigma around using food pantries, and then also the utilization of data. It's one of these things that during COVID, stuff evolved so rapidly. It was hour by hour, day by day for the first few weeks, that the traditional systems of reporting and metrics that come in that are delayed 2-3 weeks a month at times don't hold up any longer. You can't have someone manually calling every food pantry in the city with 600 of them trying to get someone on the phone to find out if they're still open. You have to be able to automate this. You have to be able to push this data out to the client in a consistent and clear way that isn't fragmented across 50 different websites run by 20 agencies throughout the city, and be able to have it so people know where they're going to get food. And that should be the same for SNAP. They should know where they should be able to get SNAP. They should know where SNAP is accepted all across the entire thing. It's just having clear and concise things based on data for these clients, because it is available. It's just a matter of implementing them.
Great. And Ida, any final thoughts from you about just long-term resiliency in this system?
Yeah, I'll just add that again, I think, COVID it's a crisis, but it's also a big opportunity. And we have this moment where food waste is so front of mind for people who just haven't thought about it before. And one of the hardest parts of all of this are the solutions that are consumer focused and are about education. And so I think, everyone on this call is doing their part to amplify that message, but we just have to keep it going. And I think what I've heard from the Accelerator, from the Response Fund, from the incredible partners we have on the call today, is just how critical the relationship building has been between the nonprofit sector, for-profit, government, all these different people who have needs and excess capacity at every step of the way. And the more we can match those up to try and, meet the needs of the whole country, the better we'll be.
Very well said, Ida. Well, thank you so much to you and to all the panelists. That's it for our discussion today. Really appreciate them taking the time, and for everyone on the line being here with us today. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Jackie to make us come to an end here.
Thanks. And I will also reiterate a thank you to Alex, to Ida, and the panelists, first of all, for taking the time today, but also just the weeks and months of work that is represented by what you've taught us today and all the hard work you're doing to solve these issues. So thank you. I'm also going to point people again to the chat box. Lily is going to be sharing a survey in there momentarily. This is an opportunity for us just to hear back from you for any feedback you have, as well as if you had questions that weren't answered throughout the course of the discussion today, feel free to submit those questions there, and we will do our best to follow up and try and get you some answers. And just thank you for participating in this installment as well as the entire series. This has been, I think, a great learning experience for us as well, and just an opportunity to get to see some familiar names and faces while we're not actually meeting up in person. So thank you for helping us to create this community through these discussions.